Sometimes people don't cross your boundaries all at once. They test them first, they make a small request, ignore a small rule, or push just a little further than they should. And here's the important part. They're not always trying to hurt you. Sometimes they're simply trying to discover what you will tolerate. Your reaction tells them where the line actually is. If you stay silent, they may assume the behavior is acceptable. If you react strongly, they learn something else. But when you calmly enforce the boundary, the test becomes much harder to continue. So how do you recognize when someone is testing your boundaries before the behavior becomes a bigger problem? Here are 7 signs to watch for. The first sign is surprisingly simple. They begin with something small, a minor favor, an unnecessary interruption, or a request that seems harmless by itself. The real test isn't the request itself, it's whether you immediately give in. If every small inconvenience gets accepted without resistance, they may gradually learn that your time and attention are easy to access. Healthy relationships allow people to ask for things. The problem begins when one person repeatedly assumes that your availability is more important than your own priorities. Pay attention to the pattern, not one isolated event. A single request means very little. Repeatedly pushing past your limits tells you much more. The second sign is what happens after you say no. Someone who respects your boundaries may be disappointed, but they usually accept your answer. Someone testing your boundary may respond differently. They might ask again, change the wording, make the request sound smaller, or simply keep applying pressure until your answer changes. This is where many people become confused. The request may still look reasonable, but the repeated pressure is the real problem. Your answer was already clear. You don't need to become angry to make a boundary real. Sometimes calmly repeating yourself is enough. A boundary becomes powerful when you enforce it consistently. The third sign is guilt. Instead of respecting your decision, they try to make you feel bad for having won. Suddenly, the issue isn't what they asked you to do anymore. The conversation becomes about whether you're selfish, difficult, uncaring, or somehow responsible for their disappointment. This is an important distinction. Feeling disappointed is normal. Using that disappointment to pressure someone into abandoning a reasonable boundary is something completely different. If someone repeatedly makes you feel guilty whenever you protect your time, privacy, money, energy, or personal space, pay attention to that pattern. The fourth sign is escalation. Once a small boundary is accepted, the next test becomes slightly bigger. Maybe they interrupt you once, then they do it repeatedly. Maybe they borrow something without asking. Later, they begin assuming they can take it whenever they want. The important clue is that the behavior expands after you allow it. They are learning from your reactions and adjusting their behavior based on what you tolerate. That's why small boundaries matter. You don't wait until someone crosses the 10th line before deciding the first 9 mattered. The fifth sign is especially revealing. Some people behave differently when an audience is present. They may make a request, joke, criticism, or challenge specifically because they know you're less likely to push back publicly. Public pressure changes the situation. Now you aren't only deciding whether to protect your boundary, you're also dealing with embarrassment, attention, and the fear of looking difficult. And that is exactly why public boundary tests can be effective. The person may be watching to see whether social pressure is enough to make you surrender your position. You don't have to win the room. You only need to remain consistent with what you are comfortable accepting. The sixth sign can feel strange. After repeatedly pushing your limits, the moment you finally establish a boundary, they suddenly act surprised. They may behave as if your boundary appeared out of nowhere, even though the behavior has been happening for a long time. This is why you shouldn't measure the legitimacy of your boundary by someone else's reaction to it. Their discomfort does not automatically mean you are being unreasonable. Sometimes people become uncomfortable simply because the version of you they were used to is no longer available. The seventh sign is perhaps the most important: selective respect. They respect your boundary when it is convenient, but ignore it when they want something. This inconsistency tells you that they understand the boundary. The problem isn't confusion. The problem is whether they feel motivated to respect it. Real respect doesn't require perfect agreement. Someone can dislike your decision and still respect your right to make it. The strongest relationships aren't built on unlimited access. They're built on mutual respect, clear expectations, and the understanding that both people are allowed to have limits. But remember, not every awkward interaction is a boundary test. People misunderstand each other, people make mistakes, and sometimes someone simply doesn't realize that they crossed a line. The real warning sign is repetition. When someone repeatedly crosses the same boundary after you've made it clear, you're no longer looking at a simple misunderstanding, and you don't need a dramatic confrontation to respond. Often, the most powerful response is simply becoming clear, consistent, and unwilling to reward behavior that you don't want repeated. Because boundaries aren't really about controlling other people. You can't control what someone chooses to do. You can only decide what you will participate in, what you will tolerate, and what you will do when someone crosses the line. Once you start paying attention to boundaries, you begin noticing something else. People don't always disrespect you openly. Sometimes disrespect appears through subtle behaviors that are easy to dismiss until they become a pattern. And that's what we'll look at next. The worst signs of disrespect that you should never normalize, because sometimes the biggest warning isn't what someone says to you. It's what their behavior repeatedly tells you about how they see you.